So we're immediately taking over for the next talk. There are no other talks in the other rooms anymore, so it's all focused in here. Coming up is David Johansson. Your slides are already ready, are they? Yeah. Wonderful. So introducing David Johansson. David Johansson is... How does that end up on that slide again? So David Johansson is not a cybersecurity journalist for Portswigger. In fact, not yet. They wish. No. David literally had short of CISO, he had all the jobs or positions that the IT security industry has to offer. He was a developer, he was an architect, security consultant, he was a security tester, and now he works for Synopsys. Synopsys, a huge or very big American outfit, doing very interesting stuff, but they also have a security consultant branch, and I think Synopsys is not present in Switzerland at all.
Not in Germany we have an office, but not in Switzerland.
Not in at least so far. But looking at, I've seen the slides from David, so I wouldn't be surprised if Swiss companies would be interested in the expertise of David and his colleagues. Please welcome David with his talk about lessons from threat modeling from the front lines.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks everyone. It's great to be here. It's an honor to be invited to be in Switzerland. It's actually my first time here, so I really enjoyed it. As we already had an introduction, I'm not going to say too much, but just briefly, as I mentioned, I worked in a couple of different roles. I started off more with developing software, trying to help develop security software, and then worked helping companies to develop more secure software by showing them what can go wrong in terms of breaking software, defect discovery, like source code review, pen test, and threat modeling. So today here, I want to share a couple of stories from threat modeling. Before I do that, maybe we should just mention, what do I mean by threat modeling and what is it? I hope that many of you are familiar with it already. If not, I would suggest you look it up, and it's maybe a technique you should start using in addition to pen tests and other things you may do. But on a high level, you could say that it's about first modeling the system to understand what you're building, and then trying to analyze that model. In other words, trying to break the design and identify if there are any security vulnerabilities in your design. And once you've done that, you also need to do something with it, right? The outputs, you need to identify, okay, what's the risk associated with this, and what can we do about this? How can we mitigate these threats? Now, that's a full day course in itself, and I won't have time to go through the threat model process with you. So if you're interested in that, there are many trainings on the topic that you can attend. But today I want to share a couple of different stories about what threat modeling usually uncovers. In other words, design flaws. So looking at this, what do I mean by a design flaw? Some of you might have seen this picture before, and it's quite telling, I think, in terms of what we mean by this. So in this case, we see there is a road, right, with some kind of security control here, like a gate that's supposed to stop cars. They're not supposed to pass here. But it reveals something very telling and true that we also see in software all the time, that while we have a security control in one place, we may have completely forgot about all the empty space around it. And there may be an easier way to bypass this control than to actually trying to target the control. So even though if we would invest more money into securing this control and making it stronger, it would not necessarily be beneficial, because when the first node starts to fall, we can easily see what happens, right, in reality, that cars just drive around it and the control itself is quite ineffective. So that's one type of security design flaw that we quite often come across. Another one is when we're using a control that by itself may be a good control for its purpose, but when it's used in the wrong way. For example, we sometimes see that people are using encryption, which is a good security control, but if you're using encryption alone, it provides you confidentiality, right? But sometimes we see people using it, assume that will also provide integrity protection, which it may not do by itself. And it's a little bit like the lock on this door here. So if you look at it, the lock may look fine, but the way it's being used in this case is not really effective, right? Because it's the wrong type of control for this type of door. So that's what we mean with design flaws. So coming to the first example, this is about security controls that on a first look are very solid and quite fancy and look good. But when we dig into it, we see that having these security controls is not enough by itself. So I was looking at this system and working with a team, and it was a business-to-business application where clients were connecting to them using web services. And they had some quite strict security requirements, and they really wanted to make sure they knew who was sending these messages and be able to track these messages to the region for audit reasons and regulatory reasons and so on. So they had many different security controls. One of them was that they had, on the transport layer, mutual authentication. In other words, the client needed a client certificate first to even connect to the reverse proxy, which was the first layer of defense, the gate, so to say, the gatekeeper to actually connect to this web service. But this was not the only control. In addition to this, they also had at the message layer using web service security standard with XML digital signatures and verifying these to make sure that the message was signed by a trusted user or a client, and also that it has not been tampered with and so on. And of course, they also were storing logs and audit logs about who sent the message. And these were not only stored on the system, but they were shipped off to secure log server. And they had applied things like encryption and signing of these logs to make sure that they were kept securely and couldn't be modified and tampered with by any unauthorized user. So looking at this, it's on a first view and discussing with architects and so on, they were quite proud of their architecture and all the controls they put in place. And it seemed this is really, really secure. So they should be quite happy with the design, sure about who actually sent the message, right? Nothing could go wrong there. But on the surface, while everything looks fine, when you start to ask them a few more questions, you realize that in practice, they actually had a couple of different security flaws in how these controls were integrated. So first of all, I started to ask them, okay, you have these different controls, right? So on the transport layer, you authenticate with client certificate, and then you check the message signature with XML signatures. And how do you make sure that these two are the same users? And how do you correlate these two? And they told me, never thought of that. We actually don't do that. We don't check. We have these two individual controls. Okay, that's interesting. So there's no check between these two controls. So how do you actually, what do you log? Who is the message from? Is it from the client certificate that authenticated, or is it from the certificate used to sign the message? And they were thinking a bit and then said, actually, none of those, because we're taking this from the custom header here in the message that we have. So it's taken from this field, so it's neither from the actual authenticated user, from the client certificate, or from the signature. What does this mean in practice then? Well, in worst case, you could actually connect as one user, let's say client A, to authenticate to the system, and then you could sign the message with a different certificate for another client, client B, for example, and the system would not object to this at all. And worst of all, when you then went to your log file and looked in your audit logs to see who actually sent this message, it could say they were sent by client C, because there was no correlation whatsoever to the actual controls being used here in terms of who sent the message in the log. So after all, we were not that sure who actually had sent the message, and they couldn't actually trust the log files despite all of these fancy controls, because they were not used together in a coherent way and were cross-checked against each other. So the question then comes, what can we learn from this? Well, I think here's one of the key things that I've seen over the years, and what we should realize is that having good security controls by itself does not necessarily mean that the system itself is secure. You also need to look at how do the different controls integrate, how do they work together, and do they support each other, especially when you have controls implemented at different layers. And another key thing here that we also see quite a common pattern is that the sender of a message, for example, the data you have in your log file and the data you make authorization decisions based on has to be authenticated data. You can't trust like end user data for that, because the user can tell that they are whoever they are, right? But you have to take it from the authenticated session. So the secure logging solution is only as good as the quality of the data that you put into it. The next example is about stepping over Stepup Authentication. So here we have a system. So it's like a trading system, you could say. It's a mobile client. User logs in with maybe a simple password, and then let's say they want to do a trade. So let's say I want to sell 10,000 worth of Acme Corp, for example. Okay, so that's sent first to the server. First thing that happens is that the server will check, right, okay, is this user actually authenticated? So the server will check that and see, okay, the user this authenticator, is Bob in this case, and we'll forward a request to the application server to actually implement it in the backend. Now, the backend sees that, okay, Bob, we want to make a quite big transaction here, and this seems a little bit risky because it's just authenticated with a weak password. So maybe we want to be a little bit more sure that it's actually Bob sending this transaction. We want to make sure that it's a legitimate request and not just someone having compromised Bob's password, for example. So what we're going to do is to challenge Bob here and perform what's called Stepup Authentication to get further assurance about who the user is. So we send Bob a challenge. Bob then responds to that challenge. Could be, for example, a OTP through SMS or similar, and it provides a response back, and we then validate this, and we mark it as being used, and we create a new session to identify that this user has been stepped up, and we have now higher assurance about who the identity is. And once we've done that, we can then execute a trade, and everything flows from there, and the user request is now accepted. So looking at the system, again, it seems quite reasonable to have step authentication as an extra step to enforce a higher assurance about who the user is when the user is trying to perform sensitive operations, like a large transaction. So how can an attacker try to target this? Well, of course, there are many different attack vectors you could think of. For example, we could look at ways attacking the client device, the mobile in this case. We could perhaps try to target the communication between the client and server in a man-in-the-middle type of attack. Or we could try to maybe replay the challenge response here, the OTP that was used, if we capture that. Now, that may not be feasible. Hopefully, that should be captured by the system and marked as used. So we might think about other ways. For example, we might try to target the risk engine. What if we could fool it so it doesn't trigger the step-up authentication in the first place? Maybe there are ways to perform this transaction without triggering the criteria that will require the step-up authentication. And sometimes that may be possible. There could be cases where you have a limit, for example. You can submit multiple transactions just under the limits, and all of those are okay by the system without requiring extra security. But in this case, maybe that was also blocked. So as an attacker, I feel I'm kind of stuck here. I can't get any further. So what could we do? Well, we can look a bit deeper and try to understand how is this step-up authentication actually performed, and how is it implemented in this system. And what's interesting to note here is that on first login, the user gets one session. Let's call that session 1. And then on a subsequent request, when I'm trying to do something that is deemed a bit too risky, it will raise the requirement right of a step-up. So the user will get a challenge, and the user will then respond to that challenge, and the system will then issue a second session in this case. So they have another session, session 2, let's call it. So if you're looking at the sequence of events here, we see that the user first logs in with a password, then is trying to invoke some kind of function that requires extra security, and is then challenged to do step-up authentication. And then once that's done, the next state is the user has performed step-up and then can perform these operations. So as an attacker, could I target this somehow? Well, what if I have an account in the system? Maybe I'm another user, a malicious user trying to target another one. Or maybe they allow self-registration of users. So an attacker is likely to be able to get an account, which means that they could get their own session, right? And they could also get their own step-up session. So can we abuse that? Well, maybe. What if we have knowledge about the user's password? Maybe we've been able to compromise that. And what if the system doesn't check that these two sessions are actually for the same user? Starting to get interesting. So let's look at that. What does the attacker do here? So let's say I'm an attacker, and I have compromised a victim's password. And the whole purpose of this step-up authentication, right, was to ensure higher assurance about the user's identity to prevent this case, right? So that an attacker, having compromised someone else's password, can't use that alone to actually perform high-value trades in the system, for example. So what I can do here to abuse this as an attacker is that I log in having my own session. So I have my session and my step-up session as a token as well. And then I log in as the victim because I've compromised the victim's password. And now, with the victim's session, I will then inject my own step-up session. So I'm mixing session 1 from the victim with session 2 from my own attacker account. And then I perform a transaction. So what will happen then? Well, in the world of these individual services, maybe in microservice architecture where each one has a single responsibility, one may check the normal session from the first login, another one might check the Stepup Authentication that that's okay. And both of these will say this is fine. But who has the overall responsibility of the user identity to correlate these two? Well, in this case, they had missed that. So no one was checking that it was actually 2 tokens for the same user. So as an attacker, I was successfully able to now send my transaction to the system, mixing these 2 sessions, and the system would consider me to actually be authenticated, stepped up, and the backend would see, okay, we performed this transaction on behalf of the user identified in user session 1, which was the victim. So we're able to actually transfer 10,000 here, in this case, for the victim by just compromising the password. Lessons learned again. Just like good security controls by themselves is not enough, you can't take a control at face value. You need to not only do a superficial look at, okay, checkbox, do they have step authentication? Yes, good, next question. You need to ask some more questions, probe a little bit, do a deep dive analysis. How have you done that? How have you implemented that? So when you look at a high-level design, you get one picture, but when you dive deeper and look at it, you may find design flaws in the underlying implementation of that control. So another thing here to keep in mind is the state model. Don't forget to look at that and also try to attack that when you do your threat model. Okay, the third one is about password storage. And it's about password storage that was secure in this case, but had some insecure side effects. So let's come back to that. First off, it started with actually an insecure state to begin with. So this was like a retail company, been around for a long time, and as many companies back in the days, they started off with having a very weak storage of credentials. So the user's credential actually stored in plain text in the database. And okay, we all realized that that's not really good. So a few years later, the IT security department realized that this is something we need to fix. Like, it can't go on like this. We have to address the plain text passwords. So when the user logged in before, they were comparing the plain text password with what was stored in the user database. For example, user1 and password 123. Weak password, by the way, so we shouldn't use those. But what it did then was to address this by creating a new model where they were using more modern recommendations in terms of using secure hashes, and in this case, a bcrypt with an appropriate amount of rounds, and using unique salts and all of these things, right? So everything looked good. And now the IT security department was happy. Okay, we addressed the plain text password problem, and we have a secure password storage. So far, so good. Everything was working out well until a few days later, the fraud department called the dev team and said, hey, you know what? We're using the user's password in our algorithms to detect fraud, and we used to just grab them from the database. And suddenly our algorithms are not working as they used to. And we're seeing some anomalies and strange things happening. And what you're sending us now is just garbage in the database. What have you done? And said, oh, we had to fix this problem that IT security pointed out with plain text passwords, right? So they're all hashed now. And fraud department said, oh, can't you just send me the plain text password somehow? Now, can you help me? I need these. So our algorithms are working. And the developers thought, yeah, okay, we'll come to your rescue. We'll figure out something. So what they did is that when the user logs in, right, we can actually store the user's password when we compare it, or before we send it to the database and application layer for comparison. We can just store it in the session, right? So then when the user is trying to buy something, we can actually pass that password along, so the fraud engine happily can evaluate the password as part of all the other parameters. And the fraud department will be happy, and we don't have plain text password in the database, and it's just stored temporarily in memory for a short time. Can't be that bad, right? That's fine. What they didn't really realize here is that the deployment scenario, of course, is that it not only have one web app server, and it was a quite large company, and they had multiple servers in the web farm, and to maintain state between these, they were using like a session database server where they store the state. So what actually happened is when they stored the password in what they thought in memory temporarily, it was actually persisted to disk on this server in plain text. It was just like hex encoded, but it's not encrypted in any way. So before they had passwords in plain text in the protected data center, but now they actually have moved them in plain text to the DMZ in a less protected server, which was probably not what they had intended when they first fixed this. So what can we learn? Well, I think one thing is that as you fix one thing, sometimes we see that people break things unintentionally. They had no malicious intention here. It was just that they encountered another problem with their fix and they tried to come up with a solution, which they thought was quite harmless and not dangerous. But when you started looking deeper into this, you realized that it had quite big implications. And I've been told that it's quite common here in Switzerland that you have a lot of reverse proxies with cookie stores and so on. So it may be time to just think through a little bit your model. What are you actually storing there, and how do you protect the data, and is that secure? So what I would recommend here is that anytime you have a dramatic change in your application, when you're making fundamental changes, especially to any kind of security controls, is that you revisit that and you do an iterative threat model, right? So you may need to come back in the next sprint and look through what did we do last time in this sprint and how may that have changed my threat model? Like, are there new types of assets or different controls we're using? What kind of threats may apply now? And one thing to take into account here that some people miss quite often is that they're only looking at the software as a theoretical thing, right, on the design, whiteboard or similar. But they don't take into account the actual deployment environment, and that can also introduce new risks and change your calculations a bit. Okay, the last example here I want to share with you is about one-time passwords, but in parallel universes. And you'll soon see what I mean with that. So again, we had a company, quite large, multinational company, and they wanted to provide remote access for the workers. So as is quite common, you won't let them just log in remotely with their normal, like Windows Active Directory credentials, for example, or something similar. You want a bit stronger authentication. So what they had here is that both the normal domain credentials plus like a RSA security or OTP that you provide, so that you have high assurance of the user and also can prevent that if an attacker was to capture this, he could not replay it, right? So if the attacker tried to replay the OTP, it would be detected and stopped because it had been marked as used. So it's quite a common scenario. Now, in this case, we not only had one server, but we had loads of users. And that meant they needed to provide a high availability type of solution for serving all the different employees around the world. So it had multiple instances. And depending on when you connected and some different parameters, you may hit different servers in your request. So what did this have on, what kind of impact did that have on security? Well, when you look at this here, at first you may not seem to be that big of a deal, but when we look deeper into this, we realize that as the user may log in first, he may hit one server, and the OTP being used has been marked as used in that instance. Now, if an attacker captures that and replays this login request with the captured credentials, the OTP is supposed to be marked as used and no longer valid. It should reject that. But in this case, and we actually did some hands-on testing as well to confirm this, we were able to, in about nearly 50% of the cases, to, within a time window, replay this, and it was actually accepted by the server. And it turned out that these requests with OTP were sent to different instances that were load balanced, and they did not have appropriate synchronization between these two instances, so that when it was marked as used in one of them, it was not automatically marked as used in another one quickly enough for the attacker not to be able to replay this. So again, what I wanted to highlight here is you can't only look at the software itself in isolation, but also look at how the software is deployed. What kind of deployment scenario do you play with? And do you have highly available layers where security decisions are made? If they are, it may change the assumptions you have about your threat model, and you may need to take into account those things as well. So in summary, I just want to give you a paraphrase I made of a quote about practice and theory from Donald Knuth. And why I'm doing this is that I think most of these cases I've seen show that we can't only look in theory and look in the design, but we need to sometimes dig a little bit deeper and try to question the design and question the implementation of that design. So we also need to learn from practice. And I think there's lessons to be learned here, both for people working in security and people working in development. Like, if you only work in security and looking at threat modeling, you may need to speak and work together with some of the developers and people working in operations and ask them, how have you actually implemented this and how does it work in reality, to better understand your threat model and identify new threats. And the same goes around that way, right? If you only work with implementing software without considering a threat modeling, you may implement it in an insecure way. So again, looking a bit at threat modeling may actually help you to perform a better implementation. And I would say this also goes for people working in various security fields in terms of pen testing, for example, which is more hands-on, versus threat modeling, which is more of a, in theory, so to say, looking at design. And sometimes I find people that are very specialized in one or the other, but I think we can learn a lot from each other. And I would recommend you, if you work in pen testing, try to think through a threat model and review the design from time to time, because it will actually help you become a better pen tester, and vice versa. So with that, I just want to say thank you all for listening, and keep calm and carry on your threat modeling. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful, great talk. Thanks. When I met David, it was only like 2 weeks ago, wasn't it? It was 2 weeks ago at the OWASP AppSec conference in Amsterdam. And I knew I have to find a talk. And it's a bit snobbish, but say finding a good talk at an OWASP conference is not as obvious as finding a good talk at Swiss Cyberstar. Let's put it that way. And when I bumped into David, I said, yeah, that's the talk I want to have near the end of the day, because I think I've been half of the projects developing these solutions. But yeah, somebody would think, yeah, I have a solution, let's do it this way, problem solved, until somebody walks in doing proper threat modeling. So we're so happy you could make it within 2 weeks' notice. Yep. Thank you very much for coming. We have a bit of time for a couple of questions. Where are the questions? Raphael, please. Can we have a mic from front rank?
Thanks for the interesting talk. I agree with Christian. This was interesting. In particular, what I liked is the lessons learned, right? Because this is what the community should, take away from such a talk. I would like to add one point to the last example regarding the lessons learned, because I believe you can simplify design. So one question you should always ask is, can't we simplify the design? For instance, in this example you have shown, I don't want to be too technical, but you don't need any synchronization. The reason why you need to sync is because you have this shitty load balancer who does some probably random decisions. But why the hell are they random? They should not be random. If you make them pseudo-random or deterministic, the problem is automatically solved, right? So what I want to say by this is, one takeaway could also be, think if you can simplify your design, because often you can. Because often developers are so deep in the system so that they don't get the overall picture and they don't see the room for simplification. So that would be another takeaway for this particular fourth example I liked. So not a question, more a comment.
Yeah.
Thanks.
No, that's a good point. I do agree fully with the principle, right, to keep things simple, because complexity is usually it adds, the more complexity you have, the harder it is to analyze the system and to verify that it's secure, right, and that is good. So it adds more, it makes it much harder to fully analyze it. What I would say in this case in terms of the synchronization is that you're right, there are various ways you could try to determine to make sure it uses the same instance each time. And that works well when you want, for example, like sticky sessions and want the user to associate with the same type of session as before, right, when you want to correlate requests. Now, in terms from an attacker's point of view, it's slightly different because the attacker can often find ways around that to make sure that it changes some parameters to something to trigger it to go to a different instance. In this case, it may or may not work depending on how it's implemented. So it's a little bit harder in some cases. But in general, definitely I agree with your thing here that there may be multiple solutions, and often the best one is the simplest one. So it's about trying to simplify things rather than making it more complex, because what we also see sometimes is that people are trying to solve problems by adding more security controls and making it more complex. But what they also end up doing sometimes is adding more attack surface and more code, right? Because the more code, the more bugs we have in a way. So it's not always the best solution to add more to it. It could also be stripping back and making it simple.
Good lesson. Yeah. More questions in the room? I don't see any. I'd like to add one. When you go about this threat modeling, how do you go about it? Are you following the STRIDE methodology championed by Adam Shostak, or what is the state of the art?
Yep, good question. Well, so there are a couple of different methodologies. The two ones that I've used the most is one is the Microsoft threat model and using like DFDs and the STRIDE to enumerate threats and so on that Adam is usually talking about. Another one is what we called in the old days CDTOL threat model, where I come from, but now Synopsys threat model, which is similar but a little bit different. What we do differently is that instead of a data flow diagram, we create what we call a component diagram, and then we overlay that with assets, controls, and threat agents, and then we try to look at how those threat agents could target the assets and whether controls that exist are sufficient or weak.
Okay, very cool. So thank you very much for coming. Thanks, Dave. Okay. Is it a little gift?
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Thank you, Make a Journey.